Hello and welcome back to our study on 2 Samuel. Today we'll be covering chapter 8, and so I'm just going to begin by reading through the chapter, and then we'll pick up and cover some of the details of what we find as we see it. Here we go, starting at verse 1 of chapter 8. After this, David defeated the Philistines and subdued them. And David took Metheg-ammah out of the hand of the Philistines. And he defeated Moab, and he measured them with a line, making them lie down on the ground. 2 lines he measured to be put to death, and 1 full line to be spared. And the Moabites became servants to David and brought tribute. David also defeated Hadadezer, the son of Rehob, the king of Zobah, as he went to restore his power at the river Euphrates. And David took from him 1,700 horsemen and 20,000 foot soldiers. And David hamstrung all the chariot horses, but left enough for 100 chariots. And when the Syrians of Damascus came to help Hadadezer, the king of Zobah, David struck down 22,000 men of the Syrians. Then David put garrisons in Aram of Damascus, and the Syrians became servants to David and brought tribute. And the Lord gave victory to David wherever he went. And David took the shields of gold that were carried by the servants of Hadadezer and brought them to Jerusalem. And from Betah and from Berothai, the cities of Hadadezer, King David took very much bronze. When Toi, king of Hamath, heard that David had defeated the whole army of Hadadezer, Toi sent his son Joram to King David to ask about his health and to bless him, because he had fought against Hadadezer and defeated him. For Hadadezer had often been at war with Toi. And Joram brought with him articles of silver, gold, and of bronze. These also King David dedicated to the Lord, together with the silver and gold that he dedicated from all the nations he subdued. From Edom, Moab, the Ammonites, the Philistines, Amalek, and from the spoil of Hadadezer, the son of Rehob, king of Zobah. And David made a name for himself when he returned from striking down 18,000 Edomites in the Valley of Salt. Then he put garrisons in Edom. Throughout all Edom he put garrisons, and all the Edomites became David's servants. And the Lord gave victory to David wherever he went. So David reigned over all Israel, and David administered justice and equity to all his people. Joab, the son of Zeruiah, was over the army, and Jehoshaphat, the son of Ahilud, was recorder, and Zadok, the son of Ahitub, and Ahimelech, the son of Abiathar, were priests. And Sariah was secretary, and Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, was over the Cherethites and the Pelethites. And David's sons were priests. This is the word of the Lord. Okay, so first things first, this is sort of just a quick overview of the chapter. This is a time period in David's life when he was experiencing great success. And in the words of the text itself from the end of verse 14, the Lord gave victory to David wherever he went. And we see those victories sort of listed out for us here. I'm just going to cover these victories in this chapter in fairly short order, actually. We look at verse 1. We see there's a parallel to this particular verse in 1 Chronicles chapter 18, also verse 1. And we see that David defeats the Philistines here. Whether this was the city of Gath or the region that surrounded Gath, basically what we see is that David stopped the Philistines from ever really becoming any kind of a factor in the lives of the Jews from that point forward. Verse 2, we see a parallel to this in 1 Chronicles 18, also verse 2. We see that David defeats Moab, and he uses sort of an unusual thing that's listed for us here in 2 Samuel that we won't see in the parallel of 1 Chronicles 18, which is the way in which he defeated and spared a few. He laid out a measuring line, killed 2 lines of people, and left a line of people who then brought him tribute. Sort of an unusual method that David used, but like I say, it's just a detail that's available for us in 2 Samuel that we don't see in its parallel passage from 1 Chronicles 18. In verses 3 to 6, we see that David defeats Aram, the Aramites. We also see this as a parallel in 1 Chronicles 18, verses 3 to 6, so it looks to be so far pretty close to one another, these two. There is something of a question here in this section, though, and that's the business of David defeating, in the first sentence of verse 3, David also defeated Hadadezer, the son of Rehob, the king of Zobah, as he went to restore his power at the river Euphrates. Well, the question that the author of our commentary utilizes or accesses here is, he said, is it actually David who pushes all the way to the Euphrates, or was it Hadadezer? In verses 3 to 6, it's a little bit ambiguous about who actually pushed towards the river Euphrates. The author in the commentary makes two real reasons to believe that it was actually Hadadezer that pushed to the river Euphrates and not David. The first one is, if you look at the sentences in here, let's start at verse 3. David also defeated Hadadezer, the son of Rehob, king of Zobah, as he went to restore his power at the river Euphrates. So Hadadezer is the closest antecedent to the word his. David defeated Hadadezer, the son of Rehob, the king of Zobah, as he went to restore his power, as Hadadezer went to restore his power. David took from him Hadadezer. So that's that closest antecedent on both sides of this. As he went to restore his power at the river Euphrates, Hadadezer is the closest antecedent to it. The second piece of this was that it says that that the purpose was to restore his power. Well, David had never had power up to the river Euphrates under his control. David had never controlled that. Hadadezer, on the other hand, had. And so, if there's a question about who are we speaking about here, basically what the author of the commentary says is this is about Hadadezer.
Whoop-de-doo! What does it all mean, Basil?
On the heels of this, then Hadadezer's vassals, people under his control, became David's vassals. And we see this in the Ammonite War. If you turn to 2 Samuel chapter 10, verse 19, you'll see this. So 2 Samuel 10, verse 19 says, when all the kings who were servants of Hadadezer saw that they had been defeated by Israel, they made peace with Israel, and they became subject to them, so the Syrians were afraid to save the Ammonites anymore. So you see that the king's vassals, the king's servants, then become David's servants because they've been defeated. So David was extending his power through the existing kings who were then under David's control. Let's turn to the next section here, verses 7 to 12. In verses 7 to 12, what we see here basically is just a recounting of David's collection of the spoils of war. You'll see its parallel in 1 Chronicles 18, verses 7 to 11. What's of note here is that David didn't take these spoils of war to increase his own fame or his own wealth, personal wealth, but instead what he did was he put them into the treasury. By putting them into the treasury, then David made room to have money or wealth set aside for the purpose of building the temple for God's wealth, or not God's wealth, but God's fame, basically. So David, in doing this, wasn't in search of his own successes. Instead, you can see that David's heart was still after God, his God, and specifically the fact that God's name would be glorified above all, that people would see that Israel was experiencing success because God was giving Israel success. We can actually see this if you look at 1 Chronicles 18:8, it talks about this, but the one I'd rather take a look at is 1 Kings chapter 7, verse 51. If you want to check in on this, what you'll see is we know that Solomon built the temple, but Solomon had to pay for the temple. Solomon had to have some money set aside or wealth and riches already in the treasury to be able to pay for these things, and that's what we see. This is from 1 Kings 7:51. Thus all the work that King Solomon did on the house of the Lord was finished, and Solomon brought in the things that David his father had dedicated, the silver, the gold, and the vessels, stored them in the treasuries of the house of the Lord. So this sort of reminds us that these things that David had collected as the spoils of war were kept in the treasuries of the house of the Lord for the support of the house of the Lord. So David was, in a sense, tithing. David was sharing the wealth of his victories, spoils with the Lord, acknowledging thereby that the Lord was the one responsible for his victories. David accomplishes a second thing by putting them in the treasury as opposed to keeping them for his own personal wealth, and that relates to Deuteronomy 17:17. You'll remember that Deuteronomy was a sermon that actually was preached by Moses before the Israelites went into the promised land. So this from Deuteronomy 17:17. And he shall not acquire many wives for himself, lest his heart turn away, nor shall he acquire for himself excessive silver and gold. So David still was showing that he was operating within the boundaries of the law that God had given them, the Deuteronomic law passed on through Moses. We then sort of move beyond that. Verses 13 and 14, we see yet again some of David's victories. We see the victory that David experienced over Edom. Although in this case it doesn't say that David actually fully defeated Edom. It doesn't begin with the same reading that David defeated them, but if you look at 2 Samuel 8, verse 13 and 14, it says, And David made a name for himself when he returned from striking down 18,000 Edomites in the Valley of Salt. Then he put garrisons in Edom. Throughout all Edom he put garrisons, and all the Edomites became David's servants, and the Lord gave victory to David wherever he went. It never says that David actually fully defeated the Edomites. So it really doesn't begin with the formula or the actual word that David defeated them. In fact, if you look at the other places, this is what's unique about this. There's a formula that you see in chapter 8, verse 1 and 3, and in 5. And it's, let's see if I can read the Hebrew to you here. So let's try this. So it's Rake, Eth. Rake, Rayod, Eth. Well, this section, verses 13 and 14, doesn't begin with that. Rake, Dod, Eth. Then David defeated. This one never says that, verses 13 and 14. Instead, what this does is it says that through this striking down of the Edomites, what it did was it served to enhance David's fame. So, throughout all Edom, David puts out garrisons, and all the Edomites became David's servants, and the Lord gave a victory to David wherever he went. So he got a victory, but he didn't get a full defeat of them, is what we would take out of the text there. In this last section, verses 15 to 18, we get a listing of David's officials that worked for him, that served under David, but served the Lord under David. It's supposed to be, you'll find a parallel on this to this section of 2 Samuel 8. You'll find that in 1 Chronicles 18, verses 14 to 17. In the ESV, what you see here, it says in verse 15, it says, David reigned over all Israel, and David administered justice and equity to all his people, is what the ESV uses or says. If you look at the Hebrew text, what it says is David administered mishpat, which is the Hebrew word for justice, and tzedakah. Tzedakah is the Hebrew word for righteousness. Justice and righteousness. That David administered these to all his people. That would include the conquered people that David preserved. I want to turn your attention real quickly to a time of the divided kingdom. This would be during the time of the prophet Isaiah. We've looked at this particular passage before. I'm going to have you turn to Isaiah chapter 5. And it's the Song of the Vineyard. Let me sing for my beloved my song concerning his vineyard. My beloved had a vineyard on a very fertile hill. He dug it and cleared it of stones. He planted it with choice vines. He built a watchtower in the midst of it, and he hewed out a wine vat in it, and he looked for it to yield grapes, but it yielded only wild grapes. So this story of the vineyard is about the people Israel. God did everything for them. He built a vineyard for them, which is the promised land. He placed his people in them, which is happening under David. They're to be grapes, but they turned out to be just wild grapes, which is why God allowed the kingdom to become divided. He allowed the Babylonians to invade and eventually the Assyrians to invade. That's what's going on if you flash forward to this time of Isaiah. Well, what was actually going on with the people? If you look at verse 7, so Isaiah chapter 5, verse 7, it says, "The vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel." So there we have the one-to-one correlation of this story that Isaiah the prophet's telling. Hey, God planted a vineyard. The vineyard is you people. And the men of Judah are his pleasant planting. The men of Judah would be the area surrounding Jerusalem, the descendants of King David from the southern kingdom at this point in time. And he looked for justice, mishpat. But behold, he only got bloodshed. Mishpakach is the Hebrew word for it. He looked for righteousness, tzedakah, but behold, all he received was outcry, which is a derivative of the Hebrew word zedekah. He looked for tzedakah, but all he got was tzakah. So they rhyme in the Hebrew. So God wanted justice and righteousness to be the way that his people, the sort of framework that his people operated under, but he only got bloodshed and outcry. He only got mishpakach and tzakah. So he wanted tzedakah, mishpat, and tzedakah, but he got mishpakach and tzakah. So they sound the same, but they're very different words. God always wants his people to operate with justice and righteousness. We look back to 2 Samuel, and we see that that's exactly what's happening, at least for the time being, under David. Now, would it last like that? No, we know that David eventually, David enters into sin himself and so forth. These are all preparations, and this really brings me to the kind of the final point that I want to make with the study here that we always look to is, what can we glean from the text here? I'm going to do it in this last section, saying that David, while he, for a time, under God's watch and giving glory to God, operated, wisely, operated under God's authority and under God's victories and gave credit where credit was due, eventually David sort of didn't do that. For the time being, during the time period of 2 Samuel 8, David was treating the people, all the people, with justice and righteousness, just like God wanted him to do. But eventually that pattern that David laid out would be abandoned by the people of Israel. We see, if you flash forward in time, to the time of Isaiah the prophet. And I would say even down to today, do we all operate with justice and righteousness as our sort of key guiding principles? I don't think so. The only one who has ever operated in true justice and in true righteousness is Christ. And so that's really, if we're going to take something out of the text, we see, of course, David has these defeats. It's all for the purpose of glorifying God. God is handing these people into David's defeat in fulfillment of God's promise that he would deliver his people Israel into a promised land, which he's done under David, right? He's done it under David. Now he's clearing the way. We're sort of seeing that servant song from Isaiah 5 really in real time during the time period of David's reign in 2 Samuel 8, that God created a vineyard for his people. That is the promised land. He's moved them in, and he's clearing that vineyard of all the stones and the things that would make it. He dug it, and he cleared it of stones, and he planted it with choice vines. He put David and David's descendants, these choice vines, in the vineyard. But over time, after David, Solomon, the descendants of David have started to, wane, and the people of Israel flash forward to the time of Isaiah the prophet and his writing. Well, they had abandoned these ways of living. And so Isaiah the prophet says, well, guess what's going to happen? God's going to come, allow the Babylonians and the Assyrians to wipe you out. Now, God was still faithful. God was still, he still stuck by his covenant. And what we know is that one of David's descendants would eventually occupy the throne, which was Jesus, as promised. And Jesus would rule in an eternal kingdom that is ruled eternally with justice and righteousness. Well, you see, this is sort of type, anti-type theology. This is exactly what we are looking for. We'd love to say that, America was the great, manifest destiny, and that we were going to live in justice and righteousness and perfection all the time, but
outside of this one church town, there's a gold dirt road to a whole lot of nothing. Got a deed to the land, but it ain't my ground. This is God's country.
man, look around. Ain't happening. We're waiting as not America as God's promised land. We're waiting for the true promised land that comes, as Paul writes in Romans 8, with the revealing of the sons of God. Or as we know from Revelation, the book of Revelation, that God has a new creation, a new heavens and a new earth, Revelation 20:21, in store for us. And it's a promise tied to land for all of those who are in Christ, which is the true Israel. That's all Israel was people who were followers of Yahweh. Well, we Christians are the true Israel today, followers of the one whom God placed on the throne, which is Christ, his Son. So there's a real promise that's tied to the land. New creation, the new creation after Christ returns, will put us on real land, in real bodies. That's true eschatological teaching, and that's Christian hope. I can hope for things to be set aright today. I can hope for, the end of a disease and perfection this side of heaven. But, sadly, or not sadly, it's not happening this side of heaven. It will happen, though. God has made that promise, that covenant, and that covenant comes true in Christ. I think that's probably sufficient for our time today. So I pray that this has been a blessing to you, that we've brought you where we needed to be, which was to Christ. And I look forward to continuing these studies with you as long as we got to do so. So, Lord be with you, and thanks for watching.